Hello and welcome to the InnoFrontier podcast. I'm so excited to be joined with Kyle McNulty. Currently works at product at SafeBase, but also has been a security consultant for a really long time and is also a podcast host. So I'm really grateful, Kyle, to have you here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's fun to be on the other side of it for sure.
For sure. Kyle, walk us through a little bit about like your early experience with technology. At what point you wanted to get into this field? We have a lot of experiences coming out of college, or a lot of opportunities coming out of college to do different things. You spent most of your time in tech in various roles. Walk us through, when was it that you decided that the field of tech was for you?
Sure. Back in high school, when I was thinking about applying to colleges, I knew that I wanted to do something engineering related and basically went through a kind of process of elimination, figuring out which kind of area within engineering I was going to end up in. So first thought it was going to be mechanical, then decided that that was going to be way too much sketching and drawing to actually make some of those different diagrams. So then I thought electrical, because that seemed like kind of the next logical step, but realized that I wasn't actually interested in kind of the wiring and more big picture stuff, and the kind of computing element was more fascinating to me. So then I was thinking, oh, well, computer engineering then, naturally. But again, realized I didn't want to actually be soldering on boards and was more interested in the computer science piece of it. And so that ultimately led to me studying informatics and University of Washington back in college. And from there, found cybersecurity. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a whole lot more. But that's kind of captivated me ever since. And the rate of change has kept me interested in the technology field more broadly.
And what was your first role kind of coming out of college?
Yeah. So when I was in college, I got to play around with some more kind of development focused roles and some internships. I got to work at a healthcare cybersecurity company called Verta Labs and enjoyed the time in development, but decided that I should give consulting a shot. So out of college, ended up working at KPMG. I was working on the cybersecurity consulting team there, a variety of different facets within it, some combination of the kind of technical skills and business side of things as well.
So when was it that cybersecurity stood out to you the most to really double down?
Sure. So I guess as far as the initial contact versus doubling down, I'll tell both the stories. The first piece, in terms of actually stumbling into cybersecurity, I had a TA for a class that was studying cybersecurity and focused on that space, and just went up to him after class one day and said, "Hey, how can I learn a little bit more about this?" And he said, "Oh, go check out this club called Batman's Kitchen." And of course, had no idea what that was, but wanted to learn more. It was a alluring and eclectic enough name, and turned out it was kind of the local hacker club on campus, and the University of Washington team actually very well respected internationally. They've done well in international competitions. Back at the time, I remember I was stunned when I learned that they were actually doing competitions in Russia. This was 2016 or something like that. So different world than today. But regardless, super interesting opportunity for a lot of college students to travel over there for a hacking competition. And so ultimately ended up getting more involved with this club over time. Was certainly never one of the best hackers on the team or anything like that. Had very few points docked over the course of my career with the team. But regardless, awesome opportunity just to learn more about some of the technical sides of cyber. And then the internship that summer that I mentioned at Verta Labs, that was when I decided that, hey, I really do like the actual real world application of cybersecurity as well. Again, I already mentioned how maybe the development role wasn't the perfect fit for me, but at the same time knew that the industry had legs in terms of my interests in it. And so decided that I would kind of stick with it, even if kind of finding a new company and role to engage in.
So KPMG, big time leader in consulting, tech consulting, and management consulting. What was it like interviewing there? And then what was it actually like working at KPMG?
Yeah, sure. The interview process was definitely um, jarring compared to like a development interview process, right? Uh, Consulting's renowned for having these major super days where you basically fly somewhere or go into an office for an entire day starting at like 9 a.m. and you're there till 9 p.m. with a variety of different interviews and more, let's say, kind of soft skill tests throughout as well. And so our KPMG Seattle team was kind of uh, notorious, I guess, within KPMG for having this cooking class final event. And It was basically you've had all these different interviews throughout the day. You've gotten a chance to meet a lot of the team members, participate in these little case competitions or whatever it is. And then to wrap it all off, you just have kind of a fun social dynamic for a few hours where you go to a local restaurant and break up into teams and try to make these various dishes. And so you're not being graded on the quality of your output in terms of how good of a chef are you, but the team actually did place a good bit of weight in terms of how well can you work together with the different people around you, how easy are you to talk to, right, and have a conversation with, and kind of build rapport with, which translates a lot into the ability to build rapport with customers as well. So that was kind of the conclusion of the interview process. In terms of actually working there, some of the stereotypes about consulting definitely hold true, especially that every day was different, right? So it's hard for me to look back and say, okay, this is exactly what the day to day looked like, and that's something that I really loved. But got the chance to work at a variety of massive companies and learn the ins and outs of their security programs, which was invaluable just for kind of framing my own perspective of what a modern cybersecurity program looks like and what some of the best practices are within that, and a variety of different kind of individual roles and skill sets as well on the more technical side and just kind of subject matter areas. So really loved my time there all in all.
I love that. You also had a chance to work in venture. What sort of advantage was it being from technology and understanding it really thoroughly, having, from the development, from hacker to consulting? How did having that technical background help you evaluate deals when you went over to the venture side?
Yeah, no question that understanding some of the problems that folks are actually dealing with on that side makes you a better investor. I will say, though, I think that's a kind of cliche answer. The other side of it is working in cybersecurity for a handful of years, even in consulting. I still really only had like true subject matter expertise in a couple areas within cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a very broad field. There's a whole bunch of different kind of subdomains within it. And when it comes to making investment, kind of understanding the technical depth and the problems that are being solved by some of these products, I think it's very fair to say that there are a majority of areas that I still wasn't equipped to be like a true expert on. So that was kind of humbling in some ways to say, hey, these founders are building products that address very niche and still important issues, and that my cybersecurity knowledge helps understand some of it, but by no means does it make me an expert in being able to evaluate like every single technology product that exists out there, and still need to leverage a network and whatever other resources are available to make some better decisions there.
I think understanding that probably made you a very, very good venture capital investor. Having worked with many of them, I think very few come from technical backgrounds. Totally fine. But it certainly is nice whenever we come, we're a fairly technically complex product, but whenever we come to you, a venture capitalist, and are able to say where we live in the dev development life cycle, and we're in testing, and they actually know what that is, and they know the issues around it, it certainly makes it an easier conversation. So even though the subdomains, at least you were aware that these subdomains existed. So I think that's pretty awesome. And then tell us a little bit about now working at SafeBase and how you got the job there, and a little bit about what SafeBase is.
Yeah, sure. So SafeBase is basically a trust center platform that's trying to help companies deal with the influx of security questionnaires that are coming their way. So if you're a software vendor, you want to go ahead and sell your product to as many customers as possible, and all those different customers have different processes for making sure that you're not introducing security vulnerabilities into their environment, and that you're completing and making sure that you're taking care of all your different compliance checks. And so SafeBase trust centers allow you to kind of position your compliance standpoint and all the different security measures that you're following. So those customers can go ahead and take a look at your trust center, and they don't even need to send you a security questionnaire to begin with. So in terms
Yeah, and
of,
I
oh, go
please.
ahead. So in terms of how I got involved with SafeBase to begin with, I actually interviewed the CEO of the company, Al, on the podcast a couple years ago. This is when the podcast was kind of just starting up. It was maybe 6 months in. Had a great conversation with him. And again, that was very early days. They were a handful of employees back then. Now they're at 56 employees. Team's growing rapidly. Got a bunch of major customers under their belt: Asana, Palantir, Dropbox, and it's an exciting place to be.
Yeah, and I was telling you before, we just signed up for SafeBase, kind of a no-brainer, where we sit, security is an incredibly important component to an evaluation of quality. And being able to just have something come up where you can see our SOC 2 documents and request those, where you can see, the fact that we are GDPR compliant, or just as simple as having a good place to download our terms, or our cookie policy. All of these different things that we have, we want easy access to. And SafeBase honestly makes you look really good by doing that. So we're getting that set up, and I'm hoping that by the end of the month we'll have that launched. So security has changed a lot recently, but let's maybe talk about current state today, the security landscape. You were talking about security as a whole, but then there's these different components. Maybe to simplify a little bit, what is security generally when we, cybersecurity, and then what are some of the core components that are important for organizations to understand?
Sure. Um, I think I'll probably stumble a little bit with what is cybersecurity generally. So I guess just trying to put that into the most, I guess, simple terms to give a definition to work off of. It's ultimately just trying to reduce the risk to your organization from different types of cyber attacks, and a variety of reasons for that, whether that's maintaining the trust of your customers, making sure that you're compliant with various regulations, and then ultimately just trying to negative consequences of different types of cyber attacks and breaches, such as the inability to deliver your product to your customers, or data theft that you have in place, or like intellectual property theft, anything like that, right? So that's kind of how I describe cybersecurity, what cybersecurity is trying to solve. In terms of areas within that, in order to go about it, you have all these different kind of domains where the industry has decided they deserve their own names because they represent kind of different strategies for protecting against cyber attacks. So you have identity management, for example. So all the different user accounts that you have in an organization, how are those protected? You have security monitoring. So for all the different activity that's going on within your company, web traffic, logins, any sort of like push of a new code version, making sure that you're tracking to see, is there anything malicious that's showing up in this activity? Application security, so the actual quality of the code that's being published and making sure there's no vulnerabilities introduced in that. And the list goes on and on and on. Endpoint security, vulnerability management, on and on. But basically understanding for organizations of all sizes, what are the kind of priorities, what are the practices, best practices that need to be followed in each of those domains to ensure that you're reducing risk as much as possible.
And if you're a young company and don't have a DevOps or security engineer quite yet, it can seem really daunting to start to take each one of these on one by one. If you're just a pretty typical software SaaS platform, that maybe sells B2B to other companies, this is a little bit more boiled down than as far as an example goes. But where would you start with a normal SaaS company who maybe doesn't have a lot built out? Where do they need to start?
Oh man, I would say there's a whole host of things that are kind of like table stakes, I guess, for any sort of SaaS company. Maybe to give you a specific tactical example, two-factor authentication is an absolute must for any user accounts you have in your organization, right? I think it's becoming increasingly common to see credentials that are published on the dark web, reuse of passwords, whatever it looks like. You can have a very fancy password policy, but two-factor authentication is a great way of just kind of reducing the risk from some of that password reuse or whatever kinds of other password policies might be mishandled for users within your organization. So that's one just absolute no-brainer. Have to go ahead and take care of it. Then also thinking about, if you're a SaaS product, the product that you're actually selling, making sure that there's no issues that are available within that. So again, for a SaaS product, I think application security probably takes highest precedent, but I'm sure you could make arguments towards any direction from there as well. So there's even like free code scanning tools that exist out there, right? You can go ahead and run them on your platform. Make sure that there's no just glaring like critical severity issues that exist. The worst thing that could happen, right, is you go ahead and sell this to a customer. They go ahead and run their own code scanning tool or whatever security testing tool that they have, find out that you have these glaring issues, and all of a sudden you've lost a customer. So I think that's something that maybe differs depending on the type of business, and for a SaaS business is of increased priority.
I think security tends to be a lower priority when a company is young and when they're starting out for a variety of different reasons. What would you say are the common pitfalls that you see when companies start to take security seriously, maybe outside of like two-factor authentication, but what are some of the pitfalls that you're like, yeah, if you're just starting down the security road, you probably have this, and this.
I think it's very easy to get overwhelmed with the different options in security, like you just mentioned, right? So, what's the result of that when you actually get started is you're probably not prioritizing correctly. You're probably not handling some of the kind of basic like governance requirements, and you're probably relying on your tools a little bit too heavily. Tools in place, but I would say common approach is that a young company finds out about a couple different security tools, they put those in place and think, okay, now we're good, right? But at the end of the day, each of those tools generally only address a very small part of the kind of broader cybersecurity landscape that you have to consider as an organization. And so, thinking about, okay, if we have these tools in place, what are some of the gaps that actually exist? Thinking about the activity of threat modeling, right? Which is basically saying, okay, here are the different types of actors that we want to be worried about. Here are the types of attacks that they might be going through with, using things like threat intelligence to think, okay, what are the common threats to an organization like ours? And then being able to have a more comprehensive approach to say, okay, these are the types of measures that we need to have in place, as opposed to being directed by different marketing campaigns. Like you saw a LinkedIn ad for a cybersecurity company, and now that's the extent of your cybersecurity program. So just being a bit more comprehensive and thinking about your organization more holistically when it comes to cybersecurity posture.
Over the past year, things have changed a lot in tech. What have been some of the interesting developments over the past year or two that you've seen that could really impact the world of cybersecurity?
Well, it feels like unfair to just say the AI security thing another time just because everyone talks about it. So I almost don't even want to go there. I mean, outside of that, I think there's interesting pieces. I know you alluded to earlier, the impact of like potentially supercomputing and how that potentially might impact things like password management. There's a really cool example that I heard where when we think about kind of quantum defense and what that needs to look like from a security standpoint, it's not just about having uh, quantum encryption or like quantum protected encryption by the time that quantum computers actually exist. Because if attackers can go ahead and store encrypted passwords now, then by the time the supercomputers actually exist that can go ahead and crack those, they'll still have access to all those old passwords, right? And so that might be useful in a variety of ways. Maybe the users have only changed maybe the users still have the same passwords, first of all, right? And so all of a sudden, okay, even though they have a new encryption mechanism, ultimately the attackers now have the plain text version and can go ahead and use that regardless. The other side is I'm sure many listeners to this podcast are guilty of the same thing. I know I've been in the past as well, where when I go ahead and change my password, I'll add like a number to it or change the symbol or whatever that looks like, right? So as soon as attackers are able to start discerning patterns between users and get plain text versions of their passwords, they'd be able to use those in the future as well. So it's basically bringing forward the issue of quantum computing and the impact on decryption to say, this is probably going to be impactful in the future. Therefore, if people are planning for that now, we need to actually bring up our defense mechanisms to now as well in order to be able to defend against attacks that still might be 3, 5 years out, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, that's really great, and I can guarantee most organizations are not thinking about that. I think that we're still trying to deal with the fallout of of AI and just what that's trying to do, let alone looking forward at supercomputing. That's really interesting. Um, Cybersecurity as a field is only going to get more important. But how would somebody who's trying to get into cybersecurity? You already mentioned it's very overwhelming to get into cybersecurity from a company perspective. Certainly, as an employee or a consultant, there's so much you need to know. What would you recommend to somebody who's looking into getting into cybersecurity? How should they approach getting into this field, especially where so much is changing so quickly? I could see the technical skill set being pushed out too far for beginners to even join. But what do you think?
Yeah, a couple things. One, I think it's becoming increasingly easy for people to get into the field just in terms of like support for entry level security roles, right? I think that's been an issue in the field for a long time, but a lot of people have recognized it. And larger companies in particular are doing great jobs with security training programs. So they're no longer saying, hey, you have to have 3 to 5 years of experience to be valuable to our company, but rather, if you're smart, you have some sort of general technical background, we'll go ahead and get you in. We'll train you on the right skill set, and you'll be valuable to the company in no time. The other piece of it is recognizing that the rate of change is actually a positive in a lot of ways, especially if you're a younger person, because that gives you the ability to contribute to things where other people maybe haven't worked in that area much longer than you have, right? So there's lots of people that have worked in cybersecurity for 20, 25 years, but if something's brand new, so let's just take AI security, for example, then it's not like those people have 20 years of experience working in AI security. Certainly some of their experience is going to translate, but if you go ahead and learn a lot about AI security, you're going to be more knowledgeable than someone that's worked in security more generally for 20 years. So that's a pretty awesome opportunity and gives you a lot of potential, not leverage, but just value to a company by having that kind of sharp skill set on something that's very cutting edge and important to that company.
Awesome. That's such a good perspective. I didn't really think about these barriers actually making it easier to enter into cybersecurity, especially where, yeah, some of these are just so new. You probably know as much as the other guy. I really like that. I think that you probably get this a lot working in cybersecurity, but we just got to know what are some of the stories, I know that you have a lot of them, but what are just some stories and maybe cautionary lessons that we can take away from some of the clients that you've worked with recently? Obviously not needing their names or anything, but just the examples surrounding that would be really interesting to hear.
Man, yeah, I mean, the first example that's coming to mind isn't a client, but it's pretty fun, so I'm going to share it anyway. But it's basically it was the ex Prime Minister of Australia, I believe is what it was. This was published in a podcast episode of, I think it was Darknet Diaries. But it was basically, he posted a picture of his boarding pass for a flight, and so there was a penetration tester that tried to test and say, okay, this seems like a lot of information about an individual to just publish on social media. Like, what could I potentially do with this information? And long story short, he was able to get into the mileage rewards account of the prime minister, the ex prime minister. He was able to get in contact with the airline and had all the information needed to just change the flight, change like different settings that came along with the flight. So basically, it's a good example of just like the information that is being shared on social media and some of these other public channels is sometimes probably a lot more than advised. And another example that I've been thinking a lot about recently, and I've been debating on how much I should actually be publicizing this, but we'll go ahead and do it anyway, is thinking about some of the like voice verification stuff that exists out there today, right? So some of the different banks, for example, will go ahead and say, oh, thank you, you're voice verified, Kyle. Nice to meet you, and what can I help you with today? Whereas as podcast hosts, we recognize that we've got a whole lot of audio clips that exist of our voices out there. So it'd be very easy using some of the different tools that exist, like character AI, to be able to actually go ahead and replicate those voices. 11 Labs, I think, is the specific AI voice creation one that I was referring to, not character. Be able to actually use those voices, create that kind of voice clone, be able to use that to actually translate like a conversation that you would want to have with a banker and perform these kind of activities that I wouldn't want some random person performing on a bank account. So again, just an interesting example of how some of these technologies like voice verification are now potentially much less secure given the rise of different spoofing tools with AI.
Could you see a world where people lose a lot of trust in being able to engage on the internet and, pivoting kind of back more into real life, because it just seems that there's so many things that can be AI generated that it's going to be really hard to distinguish real from fake? Or maybe we create tools that are able to do that. What are your thoughts?
I think no question. I think we've already seen that in a whole lot of places, right? Even before AI. Like when Facebook was first created, there were no questions about like, oh, is that person real or not? And it was very easy to discern all the time. As the platform matured, there were a whole lot more use cases that were discovered in terms of how fake accounts or just other like nefarious ways could be used to influence some other objective, right? And so today, whatever, 15 years later, everyone has a very healthy distrust for any like anonymous account on Facebook or even the post of some individual on Facebook. There was just the example yesterday or 2 days ago, right, where the SEC posted on X about a new ETF approval for Bitcoin, and Bitcoin's price jumped up, and this was actually just hackers who had hacked X's Twitter account or X account. And we saw the same thing with I think it was Eli Lilly that had the insulin prices that they announced a couple years ago, right? And so certainly there's some people who are still falling for these things, but there's also a much healthier understanding that these kind of things can be phony and disingenuine. And I think we're going to continue to see that in a variety of different mediums. I don't know if that means that like Zoom calls in the future, people are going to have to do some sort of like identity test when you hop on, like answer security questions so I can verify that I'm talking to
Hmm.
Jeff or something like that, right? But certainly the distrust grows over time as more and more nefarious mechanisms come up for manipulating these different interactions.
And what would you say are the top things that companies fall for that tend to get them into big trouble when it comes to security?
I think it's kind of proven time and time again that humans end up being the kind of critical link in these different security workflows, right? And so I'm blanking on the example now, but there's been so many examples of just like a phishing attempt or like a phone call to a support representative pretending to be someone else who works in the organization and then getting access to credentials from there and being able to breach the company at large. And there's just no question that that's going to continue to be the number one vector for the immediate future, at least in terms of like effort to reward, right? Because it doesn't take that much effort to go ahead and make a phone call to someone, as opposed to trying to have a very like custom designed malware executable that you're going to upload into a specific system. So there's kind of different attack vectors as well. I mean, that's kind of hinting at it right there for different attack types. If an organization's goal is just to, a malicious organization, like a hacker group, if their goal is just to make money, then they just want to get access into kind of any big organization that they can. If it's a nation state, then potentially they're more interested in penetrating into certain groups. So that's maybe where you get more of those kind of custom malware examples. But even then, I'm sure they're still trying all of the human based attacks first.
Yeah, fascinating. I think that is why password management can be so difficult. Obviously you can't share passwords like with inside Slack or over email. You can't do any of that. So how do you, help people get in, access management, all of that can be really difficult to do as an organization, especially if you're trying to be SOC 2 compliant and, in a few of these. What would maybe be 2 or 3 pretty no-brainer or not licenses, but credentials that a company will probably need? I bring up SOC as an example. What would be maybe a couple of those that's just a no-brainer that every company should probably be?
Honestly, I don't think I have any that are like no brainer. Every company should have this. I think it depends a whole lot on the industry that you actually work in. And go back to the first example where you said like, okay, as a software vendor, like what controls should that company have in place? It's gonna be very different based on if they're like fintech or health tech or whatever that looks like, right? And if you're a software platform selling to developers, I'm not going to go ahead and recommend that you go get like PCI compliance or something like that, right? And you just don't need it. So I think SOC 2 has become increasingly common, and like that's probably a safe bet that you probably want it. But other things, even like CMMC, for example, which is the DoD's, there's a whole lot of companies who aren't ever going to work with the DoD. So don't go to the effort of getting CMMC compliance. That's probably where I'd leave it.
Yep, I couldn't agree with you more. Kyle, this has been so interesting. As far as from the technical standpoint, people that are working in cybersecurity, what would be some of the new things that you would really encourage anybody working in cybersecurity to start paying attention to or skills to learn?
I think cybersecurity is increasingly trending towards the use of tools as opposed to the use of like custom developed code within organizations, right? So if you're an individual that's trying to learn more technical skills, rather than going out and learning Python, it's probably more worthwhile to understand some of the really popular tools that are actually out there. So people might disagree in terms of what those tools are. And frankly, I would argue that like a lot of the tools have fairly easy learning curves, right? Because any company that's designing this tool wants it to be easy to use because that's going to make it easier for them to sell into new organizations. But like Security Operations Center SIM, so Security Incident Event Management System, it's SIEM. If you want to be like a security analyst, for example, it'd be great to go ahead and learn one of those. Splunk has traditionally been very popular. I'm sure a lot of people will argue with me as opposed to whether that's like the de facto one that you should go ahead and learn. But regardless, it's just a good thing to be familiar with is one of those tools. Another one would be like cloud security more generally. If you understand cloud security best practices, there'll be a whole lot of jobs that exist for you. This falls into um, the kind of purview of what we talked about earlier. It's a generally newer field of security. It's not that new anymore in 2024, but there's still a whole lot less people that know cloud security than traditional security. And the practices change for all the different cloud platforms, right? So AWS versus GCP versus Azure versus Alibaba or whatever it is. So understanding some of the different best practices in each, and then just more general themes, that gives you a huge advantage, I would say, for a variety of different security jobs today. And then things like application security, identity management, endpoint security, you have all these different tools that exist within each one. If one of those fields is particularly interesting to you, like if you're attracted to application security because you come from a development background, which is a big thing, by the way, if you're interested in application security, the folks who do have a development background have a leg up because they understand the problems that the developers have to go through and what it looks like to publish code. Then familiarizing yourself with like any application security tool, just how that kind of works at a high level, is going to be super helpful for you as well.
Awesome. Well, can't thank you enough. Could you maybe just leave us with your podcast and where people can go to find it and a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. The podcast is called Secure Ventures with Kyle McNulty. It's on any podcast app. I interview CEOs and founders in cybersecurity. So it's really telling the kind of entrepreneurial story of how these different individuals ended up in cybersecurity themselves, how they started this company, what their career kind of looked like leading up to it, and then some of the problems that they're dealing with as well. And if you have any questions, just generally, feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on there, just Kyle McNulty.
Kyle, thank you so much. It's great to talk to you, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Really appreciate the time.